Last week we began a series about Jesus, just asking the question, who is he? Who is Jesus? Everybody's heard the name Jesus and knows which Jesus you're talking about when you say the name Jesus. We saw that, if nothing else, even during his life, Jesus had everybody talking. He may not have had everybody believing, but he had everybody talking. There were few people worth talking about other than Jesus when Jesus was around during his ministry. The things he was doing, including the things he was teaching, he was the talk of the town, really. Last week what we saw was that Jesus is the hero of the Bible. Who is Jesus? That was the first thing. He's the hero of the Bible. The whole Bible, not just the New Testament. He is the hero of the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Well, this morning we're going to see another thing. As Wayne read a second ago in John chapter 1, John talks about the Word and how the Word was in the beginning with God, and whoever this Word is actually was God. We learn later in the chapter, in verse 14, identifies, and especially verse 16, that the Word is Jesus. That's Jesus. But between those verses, in between that grand opening and then the revelation that it's Jesus, he says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He wasn't the light, but he came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. John already identifies Jesus as what we're going to see this morning, but Jesus did so even more directly in John chapter 8, verse 12, when he said this, I am the light of the world. I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Who is Jesus? Well, this morning, we're going to see that Jesus is the light of the world. He's the hero of the Bible, sure. He's a whole lot more, too. And we'll see. Last week, I'll just go ahead and correct myself. I love doing that. Last week, I said the number 4. We're going to do 5. Okay, this will be... Now we'll do 4. Just ignore the last one. Now it's 4. I wasn't wrong. I was just prophesying from this week. Now we'll do 4. 5 total things about Jesus. Today he's the light of the world. In what way was Jesus the light of the world? You ever thought about that? What did he mean? Well, he may have meant one particular way or just generally the light, but we're going to look at some different ways in which Jesus is the light of the world, even if they weren't the exact things that he was referring to, even if it's not the way that John the Apostle was saying that he was the light of men. But there are multiple ways in which Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, was and is the light of the world. One of those ways that Jesus is the light of the world is because of his personality. Probably the most underrated part about Jesus, arguably the most underrated thing about Jesus was his personality. You know why? Because the modern depictions of him are so, they zero in on a certain type of personality that I'm not convinced, and in fact I'm convinced otherwise, is totally not the way Jesus actually was. Have you ever wondered to yourself or thought about what would it have been like to have actually been around Jesus? If he was in the room. You know, there's some people that, for one reason or another, just their presence in a room changes the whole room. Depending on who they are. Sometimes it's just because they might be a powerful person. If the president walks into the room, I don't care who the president is, no matter which president, take your pick. If it's the president walks in the room changes. Period. It may be another type of famous person, celebrity. The room, just the person being in the room. But it's not always just about fame and power, but just sometimes it's personality. People being there it changes it. You ever had a get-together planned, or you're going on a trip or something, and something happens and one of the people can't make it, and it's just, changes the whole thing. No disrespect to the other people, but everybody agrees this isn't going to be the same because that person's not going to be here. Well, what would it have been like to be around Jesus in the first century? What would he have been like to be around? What would you feel, think, and take away from later on the drive home, so to speak? What would you be talking about, about what it was like to be with him? Have you ever asked yourself, did Jesus ever laugh? I know he wept, because John said it, shortest verse in the English Bible. Jesus wept. Well, there's no verse in the English Bible that is the tied in first shortest of the Bible that says Jesus laughed. Does that mean he never laughed? Did Jesus ever make jokes? Now, some of you may sound outright blasphemous just for asking that question. What, Jesus can't make jokes? Did he ever goof around? Did he ever pull a chair out from under somebody? Probably not. That's a little extreme. I wouldn't do that to anybody. I laugh when somebody else does it sometimes, but I wouldn't do it. I don't think Jesus would have done it. But did he ever make jokes? Did he ever kid around? Did he listen eagerly to the things people wanted to tell him? I pity him almost for the fact anybody in a similar position of upstanding reputation and popularity, people just want to talk to him and tell him things. And they got to listen to things and hear things over and over. I think of celebrities that are like an author or somebody that is at like a signing event where they're signing autographs at a table, and all these people come, and I bet every one of them has some sort of story to tell about the time their mom did this, or what their music or their book or their acting, whatever means to their life. They got to sit there and listen to all this. People probably had all kinds of things to tell Jesus. Did he sit and listen eagerly to the things that people wanted to tell him? Did he play with children? The way that he's depicted many times, most of the time, in artworks, I believe has more, in one way or another, sullied our understanding and grasp of just the kind of man that he was. And primarily, his personal magnetism. That's the impression of Jesus I get from the scriptures, not from the artwork, the paintings. The man I see in those paintings is not a man that could be described as having personal magnetism. It's the opposite. I don't know what the difference is, what it is whenever you put, sometimes magnets go together, but whatever it is, flip them around or something's different about them, and you can't get them to go together, no matter how hard you try. That's the man I see in those paintings. But it's not the Jesus I see in the New Testament. He was a man that people wanted to be around. Men admired him and respected him. Women were comfortable and unintimidated around him. That's a unique combination. It shouldn't be, but it is generally sometimes. The men that women are drawn to, men usually are like, maybe for that very reason, they're like, I don't like him. Jesus was admired and respected by men. And he was also, women were comfortable around him and unintimidated around him. Children were drawn to him. That tells you things about Jesus. His personality. He was a light. In a room. He lit up a room because of his personality. His teachings changed the world, but his personality changed people around him in addition to his teachings, in addition to his works. Just his personality made him the light of the world. People were drawn, not because of the way he looked, not because of anything, less than respectable, but just because of his personality. He was the light of the world. Children coming to him to play or to show him things. Matthew 18:2, we see, some of the versions mention how, seem to suggest there were times when parents brought their children to Jesus. There are other times when Jesus wanted to use a child as an example, so he said, bring them here. But that's not necessarily the way it was all the time, or even in those instances. The children may have come to him. In fact, the way he worded it then is, let the children come to me. Don't not keep bringing them to me. Stop keeping them from coming to me. Let them come to me, which seems to imply that children, when available at least, they were drawn to him. They came to him. And I bet children loved him, liked him. You know the kind of people that children like. They're drawn to them. Jesus, I believe, the scriptures depict him as one of those men. He played with them. I bet he picked them up. I bet he watched their silly things that they might do and laughed with them and played with them, played with children. That's Jesus. He's the light of the world because of his personality. He's also the light of the world because of his example. By the way, before I move on to that, there's another thing about men being drawn to him and his personality. There were people who actually quit their jobs to be with him, to follow him. That's magnetism. You don't do that if you don't have some sort of trust and faith and understanding this man is important and I want to follow him. There were other elements as well. Some of his apostles were of a certain group of Jews that would normally not want to be, they wouldn't follow Jesus. One of the disciples was a zealot. He's often overlooked. He's one of the ones that, isn't talked about much because the gospel writers didn't talk about him much. But Simon the Zealot, you know what a zealot was? Is one of the 5 denominations, for lack of a better word, of the Jews. They were the ones who were very politically motivated. They wanted, the Herodians were another sect. Their purpose was to defend the family of Herod at all costs. That was why they were Herodians, because they were loyal to Herod. Sometimes that wasn't the best thing to be, spiritually speaking. Loyalty to a certain political family or whatever should depend on the nature of that political family and their moral standings and beliefs. Well, the Zealots, what their main objective was to take down Rome. Start a battle, a war, and restore David's kingdom. They wanted Israel of old to come back and to be like it was in David's day. One of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. One of his 12 apostles was a zealot, and yet Jesus preached, blessed are the peacemakers, for they'll be called sons of God. One who said that, my disciples will not fight for me. He said, don't fight for me. He said, pay Caesar what is due to Caesar. These are things Jesus was teaching, and Simon the Zealot never left. What does that say about Jesus? It says a lot about Simon. No discredit to him. He deserves all the credit he does. He should get it, all that he deserves. But it says maybe even more to me about Jesus. The man that Jesus was, his personality itself. Because even a zealot, let alone Judas Iscariot and all that went along with him, but even a zealot was drawn to Jesus to follow him permanently, is how much of an impact he had because of his personality. Can't put it down to his teachings for Simon the Zealot, because that's what he would have had trouble accepting, was Jesus' teachings. So what was it about Jesus? Maybe it's been his personality. But his example as well. By his example, Jesus taught the worthlessness and the foolishness and even the harmfulness of the traditions and political rules of men. And by doing that, he literally changed the world. He renovated the society in which he lived, and it has still been changed because of it. You look back to ancient times compared to today, the world's a lot different, isn't it? Now, I know we, in our country, are experiencing changes too, and not for the better. But the world, if you think about it, the world has arguably rarely in history been in a better state as far as Wars and such are much less frequent. There are obvious exceptions to the rules. There's still plenty of evil in the world. There are certain countries that are, oppressively ruled by dictators and utterly horribly treated by their leaders. But as far as the borders of the world, the globe, doesn't have to be changed too much anymore. You don't get that impression back in the old times, and even in the Old Testament. Used to be Canaan, and then it became Israel, and then it became Judah and Israel, and then it became Judea, and then it became, got Samaria and Galilee, and it changed all the time. And that's a tiny little spot. The world changed a lot. I firmly believe that one of the main reasons why the world is in such better shape now than it has ever been is ultimately because of Jesus' example and teachings. Simple. Because all of his teachings are the principles and moral elevation that will ultimately bring an end to all those kinds of things. Fighting and wars and killing and robbing and mistreating people. Jesus, by his example, first of all, changed the whole world. The contrasts in all sorts of different unfortunate things. Jesus, his example, changed it more than anything else ever has, and anyone else ever has. Think about the woman at Samaria, the Samaritan woman coming to draw water at that well, and how much she was blown away just by the fact that Jesus spoke to her in the first place, and wanted to have a drink from her vessels and such. And just the fact that his mouth opened and words came out, she was already like, she may have thought she was hallucinating. Did you just talk? How is it that you're talking to me? See, all it took, give me a drink. Can I have a drink? And this is a Jew that's not like other Jews. Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, John said in verse 9 of that chapter. The rabbis said that to eat the bread of a Samaritan is like eating swine's flesh, which to the Jew would be unclean. And that would apply to a drinking vessel. You drink water from a Samaritan's vessel, that's like eating swine's flesh. That's what the rabbis taught. Yet Jesus, he approached that Samaritan, spoke to this woman, which they also said, you don't talk to a woman in public. You pass a woman in the street, you don't talk to her, even if it's your own wife. Some of them taught. You pass your wife in the street, I don't know why they would be passing their wife in the street. It's beside the point. If you did, you don't talk to her in the street. Jesus walked up, or he didn't walk up, he was already there, but this woman approached, Samaritan, spoke to her, drank from her vessel, or was going to. He was not like other rabbis. He was not like other Jews. His example, before he even taught a single thing to her, his example taught a very powerful lesson. He broke down certain silly barriers that shouldn't be there, like you don't talk to a woman in the street. Like you don't eat from a Samaritan's table or drink from a Samaritan's vessel. That's silly. That's inappropriate. Jesus found opportunities. He capitalized on maybe the only link that he and this woman had in order for her to hear the truth. Well, Jesus was also the light of the world because of his teaching. Jesus' teaching, again, changed the world like nothing else ever has. Jesus' teaching gave mankind a totally new view of God. Especially, looking forward, like as recorded in John 3:16, arguably the most famous verse in the Bible. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. How much does that verse say about God? And a view of God that the Jews certainly, at least an aspect or They viewed God as a loving and merciful and forgiving God, but expressed in that verse in a way that they probably never thought about. And that's the view that Jesus' whole ministry gave about God. Not just that verse, but everything he did taught people about God, gave them a totally new view. Praying to God, the approachableness of God. That's why his disciples came to him and said, teach us how to pray like you pray. That seems to suggest they never thought about God as such an approachable being and a father figure. But Jesus gave them that understanding. He gave a new view about God. The Greeks and others had not a very pleasant view about God, not very encouraging, kind of depressing. Thought it was ridiculous to think that a supreme being has any concern or dealings with the affairs of man at all. Jesus was totally different. He taught that God is deeply involved. He is deeply concerned. He loves all the inhabitants of the earth. He is a father figure of all and extends his even to an individual person, just like Paul said to the Athenians. God is not far from each one of us. Jesus' teachings gave a new view of mankind, the dignity of man. The teachings of Jesus elevated mankind far above philosophers, what they said about mankind of the ancient world. Jesus understood and taught that, yes, human beings are part of nature, but they're also apart from nature. They're above. One human being is more important than many sparrows or sheep or whatever it might be. And so many other ways Jesus taught that same thing. That's even a controversial teaching today, even today. You think that we're more important than the animals or the trees? Yes. And so did Jesus, who, by the way, created all of it, including us. He gave a new view of woman. His teachings, Jesus' teachings, changed the view of woman. It's so ironic that Jesus and Christianity, that nothing in the history of the world has elevated woman more than Jesus and Christianity. The very thing that is supposedly horribly oppressive to you women, sexist, oppressive, is actually the very thing that has elevated woman more than any activist, any feminist, any movement that the world has ever seen. Jesus elevated woman. One writer said, Jesus has done more for womankind than any person in the history of this planet. The influence of Christ ultimately altered that ancient sexism where women's lot used to be. Woman's lot was unfair and, very bleak, very grim, not even really considered much more than a slave or a toy, a plaything. That's how it used to be, and still is in some parts of the world. But because of Christ's teachings and influence, the fact that he was born of a woman, that's significant. We're all born of women. Well, who's to say that Jesus had to be? He could have been, God could have made all that needed to happen. That alone elevated woman. Some of his most devoted disciples were women. Jesus gave a new view of marriage, or I say new, it wasn't really new. Even Jesus said it's not new, it's old. It's new now, he says, but it's not brand new because it's the way it used to be. But it was still new to them. Marriage, the standard of marriage. No more of this, you can divorce your wife for any reason. She burnt the toast, or she's a Cubs fan, or a Cardinals fan, or a fan of a real sport like hockey, okay? Sorry. No, I don't mind baseball. Football. Eh. Jesus elevated the standard of marriage. Permanent. Jesus also, his teachings gave a new view of eternity. That there's going to be a day that's coming where every single human being will be held accountable. And that judgment, the result or verdict of that will be eternal. We take that for granted. We've heard it. We know that's taught in the Scriptures. We've heard it our whole lives, but not back then. This was something, what? That's ridiculous. But it's what Jesus taught, and he ought to know, because he's going to be the one appointed to judge. This is God's plan. He renovated the whole earth by emphasizing the eternal accountability of personal conduct. That's the here and now application. If that's the case, like Peter said in 2 Peter 3, seeing that all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of persons ought we to be in godliness and righteousness and holiness? So Jesus' teaching about the eternal accountability of our personal conduct on earth changed the world. His teaching renovated the whole earth. He preached about eternal hell, just like we saw a few weeks ago. Yes, he talked about heaven arguably more than anybody else, but he definitely talked about hell more than anybody else. The two eternal spectrums, basically. Teaching about eternity. In fact, he didn't really teach a whole lot about heaven at all. He acknowledged its existence and its reality. He didn't teach much about it, but he did teach about hell. It's where weeping and gnashing of teeth will be. It's a place of eternal fire and eternal punishment and flame, torment, anguish. And like we saw, you can go there if you want to. But you know you don't want to. And the way to determine is here on earth. There you will be held accountable for eternity based on your personal conduct. How could that not change people? It didn't change everybody, but it changed a lot. People's behavior will be, they will have to answer. Yes, there are eternal consequences. Jesus is the light of the world for these and many more reasons. Don't forget his personality. When you read the New Testament, when you read through the Gospels, don't think about how this portrays Jesus. In what spirit and demeanor would he have done these things? For instance, when he even said, "I'm the light of the world," just those very words are cheerful, aren't they? They're a positive thing. Can you imagine if he said it like the way he looks in the pictures? I'm the light of the world. Just because Isaiah said he's a man of sorrows doesn't mean he was always walking around like a man of sorrows. Yes, he was acquainted with grief, but he wasn't the poster child of grief. This was a man who was a self-proclaimed light of the world. So he obviously, you could tell just when he walked in. You could tell just by being around him. Otherwise, why were people swarming around him? Everywhere he went, mobbing him. The word would spread pretty quick as, this light of the world he's not too bright after all. Don't waste your time. But that never happened. Everywhere he went, more and more, because he's the light of the world. And then he said, whoever follows me, they won't be in darkness. If you're in darkness, you want to be where the light is. You got a light? I'm with you. Jesus is the light. And the world is dark. Follow Jesus, you'll have the light. Follow him. After all, like he said, why do you call me Lord and not do what I say? It's one of my favorite statements of Jesus because it applies so well today. So many people talk about him in good, in pretty and complimentary language, flattering language. The Lord Jesus, the Savior of the world. He's the Lord Jesus Christ. And yet they don't do a thing he said. They're not following him. They're trying to flatter him, but they don't try to follow him. Well, Jesus doesn't fall for that. Why do you call me Lord? We need to heed those words. Put it into practice in our lives. Don't just hear the words. Heed them. Do them. Do what he says. Because he's the only light. And without him, there's nothing but darkness. Well, sure, Jesus is the light of the world, but is he the light of my world? Do I actually view him that way to the extent that I'm going to give him the respect and loyalty and firstness in my life that he deserves? Or am I just going to try to, hang on by a thread and hope that his mercy is really as strong as he says it is, and that he'll forgive me after all? Why do you call me Lord and not do the things that I say? Not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one that does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Are we doing that? He's the light of the world. The world still needs that light. But he's gone. He's not here anymore. That's where we come in. We can't be the light of the world like he was, but even he said, you're the light of the world to his followers. So we need to go out and be that light. Be that little tiny light. Just a little bit of his light. And when we're all a little bit of his light, it can get pretty bright in the world. So if that light's getting dim, maybe we need to make ours shine a little bit brighter.